Hi, I'm Marcus with the IndieMusicLab.com. So you've got your song written, recorded, produced. Now what? And I know you know that the next step is mixing, but this is the part of the process often where us producers, if we're trying to actually finish our songs, this feels like such a monster to defeat. This feels like such a massive mountain to climb because it's like we have these tracks. How do I take this to the finish line? That is the big question, and that is why I'm making this video. Today, I'm going to share my 5-step mixing system that I use personally, and so if you implement this, if you actually put this into practice, you are going to get so much better mixes, and you're going to make them sound so much more professional. You're going to add that ear candy to your mixes that you've been looking for, and so much more. So if you're trying to get better at mixing, then you've come to the right place. Now, just to be clear, this is not exactly a full breakdown of how to take a mix from start to finish. This is the full overview. This is the full outline. But just to give you an example of how long that would take, in my program, the 7 Steps to a Killer Indie Song, in the mixing phase, which is the entirety of step 7, that is over 5 hours of videos in that course. So I'm not going to make a 5+ hour YouTube video to walk you through all of that. Instead, I'm just going to give you the outline. I'm going to give you the overview in this video. And even though it's not as in-depth as what is in my program, you're still going to be able to apply it immediately. This system works even if you just have this overview and just have this outline. So don't let that keep you from actually implementing it and taking this as far as you can take it. And finally, one more thing before we dive into the system, and that is if you want a free PDF to go along with this, I do have my 7 Steps to a Killer Indie Song guide. And step 7 of that guide walks you through and actually has this entire 5-step mixing system laid out for you as well. So if you want the printable version of what I'm talking about, then be sure to download that, and I'll leave a link in the description below. All right, let's talk about the 5-step mixing system. Step 1 in this system is organize and set levels. Now, this is what mixers commonly refer to as the static mix. And what a static mix is, and what you're doing in this phase is, in a lot of ways, you are just pulling in the tracks, you're not using any plugins, and the only 2 things you are in some ways allowing yourself to use are volume and pan. Those are the 2 parameters you are adjusting with the tracks. Now, I am jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, so let's backtrack a bit. Before all of that, what you want to do, and what I recommend you do, is when you mix to actually bounce down and use only audio tracks. So what I like to do is, so let's say I have a production session. I've recorded it, I produced my song, I've gotten all the official tracks into the session. Now, I don't like mixing in the production session. You can still do that, by all means. If you actually like that workflow better, you can do that, but I'm giving you my recommendation. What I recommend you do is approach it as if you are sending the stems to a mixing engineer, right? And that's what we do when we send the stems, is we don't use the same production session. We actually bounce everything to audio so that you only have audio stems, okay? So once you have those stems, you want to create a brand new mixing session and then drag in all those audio tracks into that new mixing session for the song. Now, at this stage, it might not sound that great, depending on where your stems are at, depending on whether you retained the effects or not during production, and there's a lot of variation and a lot of different options as to what you can do here, but I tend to even turn off some effects in my production because I just want to be able to work with fairly dry tracks when I'm in the mixing session. That way I have maximum control over it. But this is maybe what it could sound like when you pull them into your mix session the first time. Then once you have your audio tracks pulled into your session, what you want to do is organize. Organize, organize, organize. Do not have a messy session. And so you want to use things like color coding. You want to group the tracks. So I'm a big fan of using buses. Please use buses. Now, the terminology might vary depending on which DAW you use. So however you can group tracks, that's what we're talking about, grouping the tracks. So anything that is connected and related to drums, put that in a group, color code them one color. Everything that is related to bass, maybe you have both a sub bass and a synth bass, or a sub and a bass guitar, put those in one group. Any background vocals, put those in their group. Any guitars, put those in a group. And this will just help your brain to just feel more excited because everything is actually laid out for you in a systematic, organized way. Now, One of the things I very highly recommend is actually creating a mix template. So what that looks like is you can actually, in your DAW, and every DAW can do this, you can create your buses almost as a preset session as a template. You can create maybe a drums bus, bass, guitars, just your standard, what you tend to use. And you can even add in some return tracks as well with effects, like maybe your go-to reverb and your go-to delay. And then you can save that as your template without any tracks on it. So that way, when you go and you start your next mix, you already have your folders or your groups or your buses and your return tracks. You already have the core foundation of it set up, which just makes sense to do because those are usually the things that you're going to have to repeat anyway. So you might as well make a template. That way, for the next mix session you start, you can just be off to the races and you don't have to repeat, the same buses and all of that. So once organization is done, one of the things that you want to test before we move on to step 2 is you need to make sure that you are not clipping. So what I recommend to aim for is on your master fader, on your master output, try to aim for the average volume level of the song to be around -24. And the way that I recommend you do that is not by necessarily going in and turning down the buses or definitely don't turn down the master output. That's not going to actually prevent clipping. Go into the individual tracks, and if you're able to, go into the individual clips, the audio clips themselves, so not even the faders, but the clips, and turn everything down until you reach the point where the master fader is averaging about -24 with your average level. This is important because it is pretty much inevitable that you will gain some volume and you will add some volume as you go through the mixing process. Now, some mixers who are sticklers for gain staging and making sure that every plugin doesn't add volume, that you always compensate for any raising or lowering of the volume. It's like, I don't really care too much about that. I try to keep it in the ballpark, but inevitably, every mix I do, it's going to get louder. So please start at a super low level, and this is not going to affect sound quality, by the way. This is the digital domain. This is not analog, where it sounds better if it's a little louder, whatever. No. Start at a very low volume because, again, it is inevitable that you will turn things up at least a little bit. So then once organization is done, you want to go in and actually set the levels. And what this looks like, there are different ways you can do this. You could start by just having all the tracks turned on and then just do a few passes from start to finish and just mess around with the faders. That is a great way to do it. Although the best way, I think, is to actually start at the top, maybe with your drums, maybe start with the vocal, that's fine too. But the reason that I prefer doing it this way is, or let me just clarify, I recommend muting all of the tracks and then slowly unmuting them one by one. So maybe you might start at the drums and just dial in the kick drum and the snare drum and then add in the bass to that and then add in the guitars and then the vocals or whatever else is in your session. The reason that I prefer to do it this way is because one of the things that you are ensuring in this phase is that you can hear everything. That is sort of the gold, that is the essence of mixing, is can you hear everything and is everything in balance? So you're trying to get a fairly optimal balance. Not everything's going to be perfectly in balance, and even balance, I think I'm kind of in this weird space with that word because sometimes it's the imbalances in a mix that really make it stand out and make it special. But that's, a conversation for another time. But balance is still a key word. But again, can you hear everything? You want to make sure that in this process of turning those faders up and down in your session, that you can hear every single track, that it's adding what it's supposed to. And then during this phase, you can also mess around with pan. So if you've got doubled guitars or if you've got doubled vocals or anything like that, just mess around with panning some things left, panning some things right, and try to get a nice stereo spread as well. Now, like always, every song is different. Some songs you want to have a bit more of a mono focus sound. Other songs, maybe you want them to be very spread out and have almost like the old days, like the Beatles, where these stereo decisions are just absolutely crazy. Maybe that sounds better for your song. It just depends. But this is the part of the process. Again, volume, move the faders up and down, make sure you can hear everything, and pan. So here's a little before and after of a song that I worked on recently, where here's the before. And then here's after I organized and set levels. come back here. So that's step one of my mixing system. Now let's move on to step two, which is put first things first. Now, I was inspired to add in that specific title, Put First Things First, from Stephen Covey's, the late Stephen Covey. He has an incredible book that he wrote in the 90s, I think, and that is the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Just one of my all-time favorite reads. And one of the chapters in that book, one of the habits that he talks about, is put first things first. And the idea behind this is you need to be able to prioritize some things and recognize which things are most important, and then put disproportionate focus on the most important things. And this very much applies to mixing as well, because there is an inevitable hierarchy in your mix. Some tracks are just more important than others. Others, sometimes you can take it or leave it. You want to minimize how many take it or leave it tracks you have, because that can be the sign that it's over congested. But even within that, even if you've really cut off all the fat and you only have the tracks that really make a difference, even still, there are just a handful of tracks at the top that have the most value, that are the most important. And so this is the part that I haven't really heard a lot of mixers really talk about, because they might dive into the next step, which is my step 3 or step 4, and they might really do that first, or have that be basically where step 2 is. But I think that's just an unnatural way to work. I think it's much better to, immediately after you've organized and set levels, is to go in and say which tracks are most important. And, most songs, it's a lot of the same tracks. It's the lead vocal, it's the drums, maybe it's the kick drum in particular, it is maybe an acoustic guitar, whatever the case, for your song, which 3, 4, or 5 tracks are the most important. So in step 2 here, what we're doing is we are dialing those in. We're not worrying about anything else. Now, in this particular song that I worked on recently, the 4 core tracks in that session were the lead vocal, the kick drum, the piano, and the acoustic guitars. So those were my 4 elements, the 4 tracks that I was like, I need to put this first. And so I went to work and I dialed those tracks in first. So here's what it ended up sounding like before step 2, and then after I implemented this step of putting first things first and doing some work on those most important tracks of the song. Now, one thing I'll mention here before we move on to step 3 is I would say step 2 is also the place where you want to fix any obvious problems. Fix the really big distractions in your mix that just every time you're going through it, maybe you're working on the lead vocal in this, put first things first phase, and there's that weird frequency on that electric guitar that is just driving you crazy, or there's a crazy ring on the snare drum. Go fix that. That is also, you could fit that into this idea of putting first things first. Get rid of the distractions, because that is such a key part of being a great mixer. And that is mitigating mistakes. That is getting rid of those distractions, because then what you're left with is just by subtraction. It's addition by subtraction is what I'm trying to say. Okay, anyway, enough of me rambling on about that. Let's actually now just move on to step 3. Now, step 3, we dive into a very common and popular topic in the mixing world, and that is build it from the top, or at least that's my version of this step. You've probably heard of people like Graham Cochran or Joe Gilder over the years, especially in this online space. They've really hammered home this great mixing technique, and this is ideology the right word? Ideology is such a strong word to use, but you could say like this approach to mixing of what they might call top-down mixing or backwards mixing. There's a bunch of different terms for it. But the idea here is that you, instead of trying to go in and mix all of the individual tracks, you instead start at the top. So what is at the very top of a mix? It's the master fader. It's the main output. So using this methodology, that's a much better word. Methodology is a much better word than now I forget what the original word was. Ideology. Okay, methodology. At the top of a mix, you have your main output. And that is where I recommend starting your mix. After you've done step 1, you've organized, you've set levels. Step 2, you've dialed in, not completely, but you've added some core components and some core effects and mixing moves to those very small number of core tracks in your mix. What you want to do then is take a step back and really work from the top down. So start at the master level. And so I like to experiment with things like some tape saturation perhaps, or tube saturation. Just a little bit of saturation on the master fader is one of my favorite moves to make. And then I would say EQ and compression you can also experiment with on the master output. Although if you're starting out, I actually kind of recommend against using compression on the main output if you're just starting out, because you just have so many other things to worry about, where if you put a compressor on the main output too soon, it might negatively impact what you do down the road, because you might forget about it and then you add a bunch of volume and then that compressor is working really hard and it's affecting all of the sound. It's affecting everything, and then that can just take your mix in a spiral and just in a way that you don't want it to go. So if you're just starting out with mixing, I don't even recommend putting a compressor on the main output. But for the rest of us, if you have a bit more experience, then that is a great thing to add, because it does help to glue the entire track together. Okay, so once you have your main output at the top, maybe you've got a couple tracks in there, and let me actually show you what that sounded like in my particular mix session, the before and the after. Here's without it. Here's with it. Okay, so then once you have a bit of effects and plugins on the main output, what you want to do then is not go to the individual tracks just yet, because we're slowly working our way from the top down. What you want to do is then focus on the buses. So remember in step 1 where we organized and we put everything in groups, all the drum tracks in a group and all the vocals in a group and all the, what you want to do is process the groups first before going to the individual tracks. So this would look like if you have your drums, your kick, your snare, your hats, instead of going in and doing some work on the snare, doing some work on the hi-hat, doing some work on the kick, you instead start by putting a plugin or two on the drum bus or on the drum group itself, which then affects everything that is in that drum group. And this, not only is this faster, not only is it easier, this will actually sound better because it creates a more cohesive sound, where if you add a compressor, say, to the drum bus, then all of those drum tracks are compressed together. And so it's a much more musical approach than if you try to make everything work on the individual level. Now, you still want to do work on the individual level, but when you work from the top down, you get a lot of that work done to where then you often don't even have to even touch some of the individual tracks, because you're already touching them on the bus level or on the group level. So here's a little before and after of before I process the buses and then after I process them. And now, isn't that amazing? Do you hear how much better we just made it sound? Now again, just to reiterate, individual tracks are not off limits, but this is just a matter of when in line, like you're starting from the top down, and then the last thing you want to focus on then is those individual tracks. And you still want to dive into the individual tracks and make any adjustments, or maybe that one guitar needs some reverb, or that one synth just needs some EQ on it. Of course, you can go ahead and do that. But again, this is more of a methodology that has worked. There's a reason that people like Joe Gilder and Graham Cochran have talked about this for years and years. It's because it works. It really, really works. And it's not only easier, but it actually will end up making your mixes sound better too. So that's step 3. Now, step 4 in my mixing system, this is where things get really fun and where things can get quite time consuming as well. And that is Sweeten It Up. So Sweeten It Up is the name of this step. And this is basically where you just go in and you add ear candy to tracks, you add delays, you add reverbs, you add automation. You really sweeten up the track, because at this point, your track should definitely have a real sense of life to it. But it's still, if we want to have this song be able to play with the big songs on Spotify, we need to create color. We need to make it more interesting by using things like automation, using things like effects, really sweetening up the different aspects and the different tracks and the different parts of the song so that from start to finish, it retains the interest of your listener. Now, within Sweeten It Up, within step 4 here, I do recommend still being very focused with what you're doing. An example of that is in this mix that I was working on, I took some time and I focused on only reverb and delay across any and all tracks. So I added reverb and delay to the vocal, to guitars, to just a bunch of different things. And I just went in and I didn't allow myself to get distracted with other things. I just focused on reverb and delay for some time. And then that ended up sounding like this before and after. Just wish you were here again, and I'm what a time you want. Oh, I know it's stupid. I just wish you were here. What a time. And then another step that I did is I actually circled back and did another round of focusing on those core 4 tracks. Remember step 2? Step 2, where we talked about put first things first. I circled back around and I did some more work on those core tracks, because when you're in step 2, you're probably not gonna get those tracks completely done, because as you build the entire mix up around it, the entire landscape shifts and everything changes. Everything speaks to everything else. And so one movement over here actually affects the way that you hear the song in general over here. And then you're always making moves, you're always compensating, you're always trying to make everything fit like a puzzle piece. And so that's why it's just a great idea to come back, especially in this stage of the process, to come back and refocus your attention on just those core elements of the song, the most important tracks, and really do another round or two of dialing those in. So here's an example of that in my mix. What a time, what a time, what a time, what a time you want. And then finally, automation. One of the challenges that I actually recommend you do is on your next mix, go ahead and make at least one automation move on literally every track. This could be anything. This could be volume. That's such a powerful but underrated way to add automation, just to keep the energy. Like, you could put it on your drum bus. You could raise the volume slightly as you're going into a chorus, or turn it down when you're in the bridge or in the down section. Or you could use a filter for automation and have everything be filtered out and then slowly bring it back in. That's such a classic way. It's so easy to add filter automation, but it works so well. But this is just the step. This is the phase where this gets pretty detailed. This gets pretty time consuming. Mixing is not for the faint of heart, guys. So if you're still watching this video, I'm trusting that you are the type of person who's willing to learn. You're gonna get frustrated. I still get frustrated, and I still remember how many little rabbit holes I would go down in the mixing process. And it would just start to fall apart because I would lose complete sight of what I was even trying to do. But that's all part of the process. That's all part of learning. And hopefully this video and this system helps bring you some clarity and give you that structure that you might be lacking. But anyway, automation, just learn the skill, get good at it, because this is what separates amateur mixers from pro mixers. Amateurs don't know how to automate well. Pro mixers do. And then, of course, I'd be remiss to not mention this as a part of step 4. Step 4 is also where you just want to have fun. Just let loose. Try random things. Experiment with weird effects. Try that new plugin you just bought. Throw it against the most unexpected track that you never thought you would use it on, and just see if it works. Most of the time, it's not going to. But once in a while, you're going to stumble onto some gold. And that might be that one component, that one sound that really sets your song apart and that elevates it. So we duplicated that, and then we ran it through some crazy effects using RC20. Sounds like this together. I could wish you back. So be sure that you take at least a little bit of time to experiment and just try very random out of left field things before you wrap up your mix. Okay, so that is step 4, sweeten it up. Finally, to wrap up the mixing system, you must, please, please, please do not skip step 5, because step 5 is the thumbs up, thumbs down technique. If there is one piece of advice that I could give to you, and if there's one thing that I want you to remember from this video, it's this. Please do not finish your mix in one sitting. Just don't do it. Don't sit down, work on your mix for 3 hours, finish it, and then upload it to Spotify all in one sitting. Please, please, please do not do that. Your ears just lose objectivity as the longer that you work on something. So it is incredibly important, and this is why I really emphasize the thumbs up, thumbs down technique. It's because you need to really lean into objectivity. You need to be objective with yourself. You need to be very judgmental in a positive way. You need to be able to listen to the mix and critique it without being overly biased towards where you are in the moment. You can't be biased towards your studio monitors or how it sounds there, because maybe it doesn't sound very good on earbuds. Maybe there are some massive changes that need to be happening that you aren't hearing because you keep listening on the same listening source. So this is what I'm talking about. Now, where did I get this thumbs up, thumbs down idea? Well, I first learned this, I wish I could remember the name. I don't know who it was, but I just once remember watching a YouTube video of a guy who was giving a lecture. Now, this was on songwriting, but this very much applies to mixing as well. And one of the things, he was answering the question, how do I know when my song is finished? And his response was brilliant in my estimation. And that is, you listen to a song from start to finish, and if your thumb stays up the whole time, your song's done. Versus if you listen to your song, if you play your song, and if ever your thumb does this, you're like, okay, you need to address that. It's the same thing in mixing. So that's the thumbs up. That's where the thumbs up, thumbs down idea came from. What you want to do then is combine that with what I would call the checklist method. Is you want to open up your notes app or just grab a little notepad, and you want to take it with you and test out the mix on different speakers. So test out the mix on earbuds. So bounce down the mix, put it, maybe upload it to SoundCloud or My Drive or Dropbox, whatever you use, and then listen to that song in a new environment, and then just make a checklist of the different things that you hear now that you're in a new environment with maybe just new speakers, new headphones. Make a checklist of things that you want to address, and then come back to the studio, come back to your DAW, and make those adjustments. But that's not where it stops. You rinse and repeat. Because then maybe take it to your car for the next round. Do the exact same process. Make a checklist, bring it back, and then do that over and over again. Do that as many times as you need to until no matter what you listen to that song on, there are no major glaring distractions or there are no major imbalances. Now, you need to be careful with this because depending on what your listening source is, you might be expecting too much. So one of the things you can do, although be careful with this as well, is listen to other songs in your car, because maybe your car speakers actually sound worse than you think. And so don't be too judgmental of the way your mix sounds in your car, especially if other mixes, if you really actually pay attention to it, also feel like they have imbalances, because the acoustics of a car is usually pretty terrible. But even with that said, that actually means it's a great place to test out your mix, because even though it's never going to sound the best, no song is going to sound perfect in a car, but it should still not sound awful. It should still sound passable. There shouldn't be anything that's glaringly crazy or glaringly distracting, right? And that is where you diagnose problems. And that is why this process is so important. The thumbs up, thumbs down technique. You just repeat this as many times as you need to. So now what I'm going to show you is what my mix sounded like before I did the thumbs up, thumbs down / the checklist method. And then here's also what it sounded like after.
Oh, what a time, what a time, what a time, what a time it was. What a time, what a time, what a time it was. Wish you were here. What a time, what a time. Wish you were here. What a time, what a time, what a time, what a time it was.
So there you go. That's my 5-step mixing system. I really hope it was helpful. Now, if you want to dive deeper and you want a PDF guide that's really going to reinforce this information and you want to go beyond mixing as well, then be sure to grab my 7 steps to a killer indie song guide. Now, step 7 in that guide is exactly what we talked about here. It's the 5-part 5-step mixing system. That's step 7 of the guide. But steps 1 through 6, I walk you through songwriting, recording, production, and getting everything done so that you actually have good tracks to work with when it comes to the mixing phase, which is not talked about enough, and obviously it's incredibly important. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already. I'll just leave a link in the description below, and again, it's 100% free. All right, thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you next time.